Hey, honey. Happy anniversary. For our anniversary, I figured I would narrate a part of the new novel I'm working on. I wrote a little vignette with my character, my self-insert character, Jason, or as I'm calling him in this one, Marcus, and the character I made for you, whose name is Dara. So I hope you enjoy it, and happy anniversary, honey. I love you. The sight of a collar around her neck incensed him. Of all the ignoble fates to befall one of their kind, this was certainly the worst. Degraded to the point of being property was a fate fit for others, not them. What do you mean you're claimed? She shrugged her shoulders and looked back down at the flagon of mead in her hands. It's simple, Jason. I belong to Chernov. That maid you saw outside. Puerile nonsense. It belonged to no one. That well of anger at her indifference began to simmer. Maybe you don't. But you see this thing? She said, brushing her fingers across the leather strap around her throat. Says otherwise. I tried breaking it once, and what power I had is long since gone. He grabbed her hand abruptly and yanked her out of the bar stool. She made a surprised sound and opened her mouth to protest, but by the time she collected herself enough to object, he'd already pulled her to the back of the room and out of sight. Without a word, the darkness by their feet twisted and boiled over, engulfing them both and dragging them through the floor. He'd had plenty of encounters with would-be dark lords and fanatical paladins, but one thing he knew with crystal clarity was that none possessed the strength to control their kind. Even the Umbrans, with their command of occult rituals meant to summon the abyss into physical form, could do little more than persuade. They bound nothing that did not want to be bound, and that Chernov wretch was no Umbran. They fell for a time before landing roughly on a shadowy simulacrum of stone, a circular floor of polished obsidian. She cried out at the unexpected impact. He ignored it. On your feet. Jason, what are you? Get up and look around, Dara. Look where we are. Does this strike you as the kind of place you could access if you were bound by some unshakable magic? He stared straight at her, gaze boring into her as she avoided making eye contact. She picked herself up and curled her arms around her, uncomfortable with where they were. He scoffed. We are both born of this. This is where we come from. This is what we are, and no amount of hawk and sleight of hand can change that fact. Nothing controls us except that our own acquiescence. Now tear that collar off your neck. What? No, I can, or he'll... He'll what? Marcus snapped, cutting her off. He's not here, and if he was, he'd be screaming to be returned. We'll deal with that later. Now take it off. She pursed her lips and clutched at her sides. Just forget about it, Jason. Take me back. I don't want to be here. No. Take off the collar. No one owns you. Please, just take me back. He leapt forward and snatched her up by her jaw, lifting her off the obsidian floor and digging claw-like nails into the porcelain of her cheeks. His eyes shone like burning coals, and his mouth was once again filled with razor-sharp daggers for teeth. You're no one's pet, he growled, voice now a mix of man and beast, guttural and cruel. Take off the fucking collar. She'd borne his disdain with indifference, but the sight of him grabbing her violently and denying her complaints reached her. Something about the way he moved shook her out of her apathy, and a faint glow returned to her lilac eyes. She reached up, sliding her fingertips around the leather with halting, inching movements. She stared down at him, biting at her bottom lip. What if it does exactly what he said it would do? He said it would destroy me, that it would break me down into nothingness. All I'd be is the void. You should know better. Only one thing that can send us back to the void, and cheap leather isn't it. Now take it off! He'd had the desired effect on her so far, but the way she stumbled right here, at the cusp of victory, enraged him further. Whatever due was owed Chernov, that would wait until later. Right now, the only thing he needed Dara to do was realize that, contrary to what that charlatan had convinced her, the only thing keeping her claimed was her own will. After her hesitation, he dug his claws into her face, drawing black blood from her flawless skin. She cried out and reflexively snapped her arms down from her neck, tearing the collar from around her without struggle. Marcus released his hold on her face and set her back down on her feet. She swallowed roughly, reaching up to touch where the wounds had been. To her surprise, they had already closed, the oily black oozing from them now reabsorbed into her body. She looked to Marcus confused. He simply grinned. Now you see. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise. You, and you alone, control your destiny. He held out his hand to her. Now that's over with. I think you should pay Chernov a visit. She slid her hand into his, rolling her jaw back and forth until it popped. She gazed up at him and smiled, if only slightly. Without another word, he drew them back up through the pooling darkness on the floor where they'd been, returning them silently to the world. She stood there for a moment, still as a statue. Just when he thought she might revert back, she drew one hand up in front of her. Her nails lost their color, becoming the same obsidian black as the realm they'd just left. It oozed down her arm as her nails became long, pointed claws. She looked over her shoulder at him and smiled again, this time more assertive. He smirked in return and motioned with his head for the door. They found Chernov outside, drunkenly pawing at a prostitute behind the tavern. Her surprise and disdain at having company was quickly silenced by the look Marcus gave her, and the prostitute decided retreat was the better option. The drunk mage, on the other hand, was not nearly as smart. The only thing he seemed to notice or care about was the collar missing from around Dara's neck. "What did I tell you about that collar, you wretch?" He spat, fumbling with the tie of his pants before straightening his robes back down his legs. "You'll pay for your insolence. And I swear I'll—" "You'll what, Chernov?" she interrupted, lilac eyes now glowing just like Marcus's were. His long obsidian claws lifted from her side, sliding against each other with an agonizing squeal that caused the man to grimace. "What will you do?" Unlike Marcus, her voice wasn't the low growl of a dragon or beast. It had an ethereal quality, soft and sweet, melodic, and yet sinister all the same. Chernov looked between the two before diving his hands into his robes, frantically looking for something. It didn't much matter what it was. Before he could find it, Dara had dug her claws through his shoulder, hoisting him up off the ground and pinning him to the wall of the tavern behind him. He cried out in pain, terror crossing his face. No doubt by now he'd realized whatever trick he'd work on her to break her spirit was revealed to be only an illusion, and she was as terrifying a creature as he could have imagined. She brought her other hand up, forming obsidian claws out of her fingertips and cutting clean through his robes and his shirt, revealing his bare chest. "Do you remember what you said to me all those years ago?" Her head tilted and she smiled disarmingly. "You said that so long as there is breath in your body, I would be bound forever to be your servant?" It didn't take long for the realization to dawn on Chernov, but then it didn't take long for Dar to keep him from screaming either. She tore her claws through his chest, bones snapping and muscle tearing as she reached in to grab his heart. With a sharp jerk, she snatched it out of his body and held it in front of him, giving a perfect view of the organ with the few seconds of life he had left. He choked and shuddered, eyes wide before reality caught up with his terrifying realization. His body slumped in her grasp, and she dropped it to the cobblestone floor at her feet. Without uttering another word, she dug into the heart in her hands, tearing it apart with her teeth and devouring the organ in large, uncontrolled bites. A few seconds later, and she was licking the blood from her fingers, wiping her mouth away with the back of her once again delicate hand. Marcus just leaned one shoulder against the wall of the tavern, a curious little smirk on his lips. She looked at him and smiled, her eyes gleaming in the dim light of the alleyway. Suddenly, she ran to him and threw her arms around his waist, hugging him tightly and burying her face against his shoulder. "Thank you," she mumbled. He stood there awkwardly for a moment before his arms slid around her shoulders. "For what?" "For saving me." "Did nothing of the sort. Just got you to stop believing an idiot." She laughed a little, squeezing him a little tighter, her body pressed as close as she could manage to his. "This time, Jason, you are my hero."